The boarding house dining room fell silent the moment Clara Kingston walked through the door. Her dress so patched and faded that the original calico pattern was barely visible beneath the layers of mismatched fabric she had stitched on by candlelight. It was the spring of 1878 in El Dorado, Kansas, a cattle town that had grown prosperous from the herds that passed through on their way north. And the dozen men and women gathered for Sunday supper took one look at her threadbare appearance before the whispers started like wildfire through dry grass. She held her head high despite the burning shame that crept up her neck, her fingers clutching the small coin purse that contained the last of her money, enough for one meal before she would have to figure out how to survive another day in this unforgiving place. The laughter started low at first, barely concealed behind raised hands and sidelong glances, but it grew bolder when Mrs. Harriet Pembroke, the banker's wife draped in green silk that probably cost more than Clara had earned in a year of teaching back in Missouri, made a show of lifting her skirts as Clara passed, as though poverty might be contagious. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept walking toward the only empty seat in the room, a small table near the kitchen door where the heat from the stove made the air shimmer, and the noise of clattering pots would make conversation impossible. She had been in El Dorado for 3 days, having arrived on the train with nothing but a carpet bag containing 2 other dresses in similar condition, a Bible her mother had given her before the fever took her, and the deed to a property she had inherited from an uncle she had never met, a man who had apparently thought enough of his sister's daughter to leave her something in this world. The property, as it turned out, was a joke, a cruel trick played by fate or perhaps by her uncle's addled mind in his final days. The land office clerk had barely suppressed his amusement when she presented the deed, and after making her wait for 2 hours while he verified the paperwork, he informed her that she was now the proud owner of a collapsed soddy 20 miles outside of town on land so poor that even the prairie grass struggled to grow. No water rights, no timber, no value whatsoever, except perhaps as a cautionary tale about the promises of westward expansion. She had thanked him with as much dignity as she could muster, and walked out into the bright Kansas sunshine with the devastating knowledge that she was utterly alone and nearly destitute in a place where she knew no one. The boarding house keeper, a thin woman with suspicious eyes and a mouth like a steel trap, approached Clara's table with obvious reluctance, her lips pressed together in disapproval as she looked down at the young woman who had dared to enter her establishment looking like a beggar. Clara ordered the cheapest item on the menu, a bowl of stew and a slice of bread, and counted out the coins with shaking hands, praying that the prices had not increased since she had checked the board outside. The keeper snatched the money without a word and disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Clara alone with the weight of a dozen stairs on her back and the sound of laughter that seemed to echo off the pressed tin ceiling. That was when Wade Hamilton walked in, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted like a change in the wind before a storm. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway and a presence that seemed to command attention without any effort at all. His clothes were dusty from the trail but well made, the clothes of a man who worked hard but had the means to pay for quality, and his boots, though worn, had been expensive once and were still serviceable. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark brown hair that was slightly too long and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of countless hours under the open sky. His eyes, a startling shade of blue-gray that reminded Clara of the sky just before dawn, swept the room in a quick assessment before landing on her, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their gazes locked. Clara looked away first, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons she could not quite name, and she focused instead on the worn grain of the wooden table in front of her, tracing the patterns with her eyes and trying to ignore the renewed whispers that had started up around the room. Wade Hamilton was known in these parts. That much was clear from the way people greeted him with genuine warmth and respect. And she listened as he exchanged pleasantries with several of the other diners, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest, even from across the room. He asked about families and cattle and the spring planting, the kinds of questions that showed he actually cared about the answers. And Clara found herself stealing glances at him from beneath her lashes, taking in the strong line of his jaw and the way his hands, scarred and calloused from work, moved with surprising grace. When the keeper returned with Clara's stew, she set it down with more force than necessary, slopping some of the thin broth onto the table, and Clara murmured her thanks even though the woman had already turned away. The stew was mostly water with a few chunks of potato and what might have been beef floating in it, and the bread was hard enough that she had to tear at it with her teeth, but it was food and she was grateful for it. She ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion for weeks now, ever since her money had started running out, and she had been forced to choose between eating and paying for the tiny room she rented above the general store. She was halfway through her meal when she became aware that someone was standing beside her table, and she looked up to find Wade Hamilton gazing down at her with an expression she could not quite read. Up close, he was even more imposing, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. "Madam, I could not help but notice that you are dining alone, and I wonder if you might allow me to join you," he said, and there was nothing of pity in his tone, only a simple courtesy that made her want to weep. "I have been on the trail for 3 days, and I am not fit company for the fine folks in this room. But if you would not mind the smell of cattle and dust, I would be honored to share your table." Clara's first instinct was to refuse, to protect what little pride she had left, but something in his steady gaze made her reconsider. Perhaps it was the exhaustion that had seeped into her bones, or perhaps it was the simple human need for kindness after days of being treated as less than nothing. But she found herself nodding and gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Wade's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and somehow more approachable, and he settled into the chair with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. "My name is Wade Hamilton," he said, extending his hand across the table. "I run a ranch about 15 miles west of here." "Clara Kingston," she replied, placing her small hand in his and feeling the rough warmth of his palm against hers. The contact sent a strange shiver up her arm, and she withdrew her hand quickly, folding it in her lap with its partner. "I am new to El Dorado." "I had not seen you before," Wade said, his eyes taking in her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Are you passing through or staying?" It was a simple question, but Clara found she did not have a simple answer. Was she staying? Could she stay with no prospects and no money? She hesitated, searching for words that would not reveal too much about her desperate circumstances, but something about Wade's open expression made her want to tell him the truth. "I inherited property here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "From an uncle I never met. I came to see if I might make a life here, but I am beginning to think that was foolish of me." Wade leaned back in his chair, studying her with those remarkable eyes, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he could see straight through to her soul, past all the carefully constructed walls she had built to protect herself from further hurt. The keeper appeared at his elbow, all smiles now, and took his order with an eagerness that she had not shown Clara. Wade ordered enough food for 3 men, and then, before Clara could protest, asked for another bowl of stew and more bread to be brought to the table. "I did not mean for you to buy me more food," Clara said quickly, her cheeks flaming with embarrassment. "I have already eaten." "That was not a meal, that was an insult," Wade said matter-of-factly. "And you look like you could use a proper supper. Please let me do this. I have more money than I need and nowhere particular to spend it." The keeper brought the food quickly, and this time the portions were generous and the bread was fresh and soft. Clara's stomach growled audibly at the sight and smell, and Wade pretended not to notice, busying himself with his own meal and giving her the privacy to eat without being watched. She tried to maintain some semblance of manners, but the food was the best thing she had tasted in weeks, and she found herself eating with an enthusiasm that would have mortified her under other circumstances. Wade ate steadily, occasionally commenting on the weather or asking her questions about where she had come from, questions that she answered between bites, gradually relaxing in his presence as it became clear that he had no ulterior motives for his kindness. She told him about Missouri, about the small town where she had taught school until the school board had decided they could no longer afford a teacher and had closed the schoolhouse indefinitely. She told him about her mother's death the previous winter and how she had been left with nothing but debts and memories. She did not tell him about the weeks of hunger that had followed, or about the landlord who had suggested she might pay her rent in ways that had made her flee in the middle of the night with whatever she could carry, or about the terror of being a woman alone with no protection and no prospects. But somehow, looking into Wade's kind eyes, she thought perhaps he understood anyway. When she had eaten her fill and could not possibly take another bite, Wade pushed back from the table and stood, reaching for his wallet. He paid for both meals and left a generous tip that made the keeper's eyes widen, and then he turned back to Clara with a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "Miss Kingston, I know we have only just met and you have no reason to trust me, but I would like to make you a proposition," he said, and Clara felt her stomach drop, the food she had just eaten threatening to come back up. She had heard propositions before, had learned to recognize the look in a man's eyes when he thought a woman down on her luck might be willing to compromise her morals for security, and she prepared herself to stand and walk out with whatever dignity she could salvage. But Wade continued, apparently oblivious to her sudden tension. "I have a large ranch and I am in need of help. My housekeeper left last month to live with her daughter in Wichita, and I have been managing on my own. But the truth is I am a terrible cook, and the house is falling into disorder. I also have a considerable amount of correspondence that needs attention, accounts that need to be kept, and various other tasks that I simply do not have time for while managing the ranch. If you are willing, I would like to offer you a position as my housekeeper and assistant. The pay is fair, room and board included, and you would have your own quarters with a lock on the door. I give you my word as a gentleman that I would expect nothing from you except honest work." Clara stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. It seemed too good to be true, the kind of miracle that did not happen to women like her, and her natural suspicion warred with the desperate hope that bloomed in her chest. She searched his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some elaborate trick, but all she saw was sincerity and perhaps a touch of awkwardness, as though he was not accustomed to making such offers. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice hoarse. "You do not know me. I could be a thief or worse. Why would you offer this to a stranger?" Wade was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the other diners, who were making no attempt to hide their interest in the conversation. When he looked back at her, There was something fierce in his expression that made her breath catch. "Because I saw how they treated you when you walked in here," he said softly. "I saw them laugh at your dress and whisper about you as though you were not a person deserving of basic human decency. And I saw you hold your head high and refuse to let them break you. That tells me more about your character than 100 letters of reference ever could. I think you are a woman who has had a run of bad luck, but who has not let it destroy her spirit. And I think you deserve a chance to prove what you are capable of when given the opportunity." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously, not wanting to break down in front of this man, who had shown her more kindness in an hour than she had experienced in months. She thought about the alternative, about the cold room above the general store and the dwindling coins in her purse, about the very real possibility that she would be on the streets within a week with nowhere to go and no way to survive. She thought about the collapsed soddy on worthless land and the bleak future that stretched before her if she did not take this chance. "I accept," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "And I promise you will not regret giving me this opportunity. I will work harder than anyone you have ever employed." Wade's smile was brilliant, transforming his face once again, and he extended his hand to seal the agreement. This time, when Clara placed her hand in his, she felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the kitchen stove. They shook hands solemnly, and Clara had the strange sensation that her entire life had just changed direction. That fate had intervened in the form of a cowboy with kind eyes and a generous heart. They left the boarding house together, walking out into the cool evening air while the whispers erupted behind them like a stirred hornet's nest. Clara knew that by tomorrow the entire town would be speculating about the nature of their relationship, but for the first time in a long while, she found that she did not care what people thought. She had been given a lifeline, and she intended to grasp it with both hands. Wade led her to where his horse was tied, a magnificent bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition, and he helped her gather her few belongings from the room she had rented. The landlord, a greasy man who had been watching her with increasing interest over the past few days, seemed disappointed to see her go, especially in the company of Wade Hamilton, who apparently commanded enough respect in the community that no one would dare speak against him. Within an hour, Clara was seated beside Wade in a wagon he had borrowed from the livery, her carpetbag at her feet and the endless Kansas prairie stretching out before them in the fading light. They traveled in companionable silence for the first few miles, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. The land was beautiful in its own stark way, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that rippled like waves in the breeze, and Clara found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, the tension draining from her shoulders as they put distance between themselves and the town. Wade pointed out landmarks as they passed, a creek that ran year-round, a distinctive rock formation, a line of cottonwood trees that marked the northern boundary of his property. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, they crested a rise and Clara saw the ranch spread out below them. It was larger than she had expected, with a substantial two-story house built of timber and stone, a massive barn, several outbuildings and corrals that held dozens of cattle. Smoke curled from the chimney of the house, and lanterns glowed in the windows, making it look warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion at the sight of it, this place that would be her home, at least for a while, and she sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever power had brought Wade Hamilton into the boarding house dining room at the exact moment when she had needed him most. Wade drove the wagon up to the front of the house and helped her down, his hands strong and steady on her waist. And for a moment, they stood there in the twilight, looking at each other. Clara was acutely aware of how close he was, of the warmth radiating from his body, and the way his eyes seemed to darken in the fading light. Then the moment passed, and Wade stepped back, reaching for her carpet bag and gesturing toward the house. "Let me show you around," he said, and Clara followed him up the steps and through the front door into a world that seemed impossibly grand compared to the places she had been living. The house was indeed in need of attention, with dust covering most surfaces and dishes piled in the kitchen sink, but the bones of it were solid and beautiful. There was a large main room with a stone fireplace, a dining area with a table that could seat 10, a kitchen with a modern cast iron stove, and upstairs, 4 bedrooms, each with its own fireplace. Wade showed her to the room that would be hers, a corner room with windows facing both south and east, furnished with a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a rocking chair. There was a rag rug on the floor and curtains at the windows, simple but clean, and when Wade demonstrated the lock on the door, operating it several times to show her that it worked perfectly, Clara felt the last of her fears ease. This was real. This was happening. She had a job and a home and a chance to start over. "I will let you get settled," Wade said from the doorway, his hat in his hands again. "The privy is out back, about 30 yards from the house, and there is a pump in the kitchen for water. I will be up early to see to the cattle, but I usually come in for breakfast around 7 if you are inclined to cook. If not, I can manage on my own until you feel comfortable in the kitchen." "I will have breakfast ready," Clara said firmly. "That is what you hired me for, after all." Wade nodded, that small smile playing around his lips again. "Good night, then, Miss Kingston. I hope you sleep well." "Good night, Mr. Hamilton," she replied, "and thank you for everything." He left, pulling the door closed behind him, and Clara heard his boots on the stairs, and then the sound of another door closing down the hall. She stood in the middle of her new room, taking in the simple furnishings and the clean smell of sun-dried linens, and then she sat down on the bed and allowed herself to cry. They were not tears of sadness or despair, but tears of relief and gratitude and hope, emotions so powerful that they shook her entire body. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she washed her face in the basin, changed into her nightgown, and climbed into the most comfortable bed she had slept in for months. She woke before dawn, her internal clock still set to the rhythms of a life that required her to make the most of every moment of daylight. She dressed quickly in the same patched dress she had worn the day before, it being the least damaged of her 3 dresses, and made her way downstairs to the kitchen. In the gray light of early morning, the disorder was even more apparent than it had been the night before, but Clara rolled up her sleeves and set to work. She found coffee and got a pot brewing, then tackled the mountain of dishes, heating water on the stove and scrubbing each plate and cup until it gleamed. While the dishes dried, she investigated the pantry and was pleased to find it well stocked with flour, beans, rice, canned goods, and various other staples. There was a smokehouse behind the kitchen with bacon and ham hanging from the rafters, and a springhouse where she found butter, eggs, and milk. She selected what she needed and returned to the kitchen to prepare a breakfast that would set the tone for her employment. She made biscuits from scratch, fried bacon and eggs, and even managed to find some preserves to serve alongside the fresh butter. She was just setting everything on the table when Wade came down the stairs, his hair damp from washing and his face cleanly shaved. He stopped in the doorway of the dining room, taking in the spread she had prepared and the transformation of the kitchen visible beyond. And the expression on his face made every minute of her early morning labor worthwhile. "Miss Kingston, this is incredible," he said, moving to the table and looking at the food as though he could not quite believe it was real. "I have not had a breakfast like this since my mother passed away 3 years ago." "Please sit and eat while it is hot," Clara said, pouring coffee into a clean cup and setting it at his place. She hesitated, unsure of the proper protocol. "Should I take my meals in the kitchen?" Wade looked up at her, his expression incredulous. "You will take your meals here at this table with me. I did not hire you to be a servant, Miss Kingston. I hired you to help me run this ranch, and that makes you a partner of sorts, not a subordinate. Please, sit down and join me." Clara sat, feeling awkward and uncertain, but Wade began to eat with such obvious enjoyment that she soon relaxed and served herself a small portion. They ate in silence for a few minutes, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that did not require filling with empty chatter. Eventually, Wade began to talk about the ranch, explaining the rhythms of the work and what he would need from her. He had 3 men who worked for him full-time, cowboys who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn and who took their meals there. But he often had business associates or neighbors stop by, and it would be helpful if she could manage those social obligations. He also had contracts with several cattle buyers, and the paperwork was becoming overwhelming, so if she had any skill with figures, he would be grateful for her assistance. Clara assured him that she had managed the accounts for the school where she taught, and would be happy to help with his business records. As they talked, she found herself studying him covertly, trying to understand what kind of man would take a stranger into his home based on nothing more than intuition and compassion. He was clearly successful. The ranch and the quality of the furnishing spoke to that, but there was no arrogance in him, no sense that he considered himself better than anyone else. He spoke about his workers with genuine respect and affection, and when he mentioned his late mother, there was a grief in his voice that told Clara he had loved her deeply. After breakfast, Wade showed her where he kept the business ledgers and correspondence, and Clara spent the morning going through them, bringing order to chaos, and making sense of transactions that had been recorded haphazardly, if at all. She had a natural aptitude for figures, and she found the work satisfying, the clear logic of debits and credits a welcome change from the uncertainty that had plagued her recent life. At midday, she prepared a simple lunch of sandwiches and took one out to Wade where he was working in the corral with a young horse, and she leaned on the fence to watch him work. He moved with the horse with infinite patience, speaking to it in a low, soothing voice, and never making any sudden movements that might frighten the animal. Clara knew nothing about horses beyond the basic mechanics of riding, but even she could see that Wade had a gift, a natural understanding of the creatures that allowed him to communicate with them in ways that seemed almost magical. The young horse, which had been skittish and nervous when she first arrived, gradually calmed under Wade's steady handling, and by the time he called a halt to the session, it was accepting his touch and even following him around the corral like a devoted dog. Wade climbed over the fence and accepted the sandwich with a grateful smile, and they sat together on a bench outside the barn, eating in the warm spring sunshine. One of the cowboys, a grizzled man named Tom who had to be 60 if he was a day, came over to meet Clara and welcomed her to the ranch with a courtliness that surprised her. He was followed by the other 2 men, Jake and Samuel, both younger and less talkative but equally polite, and Clara realized that Wade had chosen his employees well. These were good men, hardworking and honest, the kind of men who would give their loyalty to an employer who treated them fairly. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm after that. Clara woke before dawn and prepared breakfast, then spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house that had been neglected for too long. In the afternoons, she worked on the accounts and correspondence, gradually bringing order to Wade's business affairs, and even identifying several instances where he had been underpaid or overcharged. She prepared substantial dinners that Wade and she shared at the big table, and in the evenings, they often sat by the fireplace, talking about their lives and their dreams. Clara learned that Wade had been born on this ranch, that his father had carved it out of the prairie through sheer determination and backbreaking labor, and that Wade had inherited it when his father died in a riding accident 10 years earlier. His mother had stayed on, helping him run the household until her heart had given out 3 years ago, leaving Wade alone in the big house with only his memories for company. He had thrown himself into the work of the ranch, building it into one of the most successful operations in the county. But he admitted that the loneliness had become oppressive, that he had begun to dread coming back to the empty house at the end of each day. Clara, in turn, told him more about her own past, about the father who had died when she was 12 and the mother who had struggled to support them by taking in washing. She told him about her love of learning and how the local school teacher had recognized her intelligence and had tutored her privately, preparing her to take the teaching examination. She told him about the joy she had found in teaching, in seeing children's faces light up when they finally grasped a difficult concept, and the devastation she had felt when the school had closed. She did not tell him about the darkest days that had followed, but she thought perhaps he understood anyway, filling in the gaps with his own imagination. As the weeks passed, Clara found herself looking forward to those evening conversations more and more. Wade was intelligent and well-read, surprising for a man who spent his days working cattle, and he challenged her intellectually in ways that she had not experienced since leaving Missouri. They debated politics and philosophy, discussed books they had read, and shared their observations about the world around them. Clara felt her mind awakening from the numbness that had settled over it during the hard months, and she realized that she was happy, truly happy, for the first time in longer than she could remember. But there was something else growing beneath the surface of their easy friendship, something that made Clara's heart race when Wade smiled at her across the dinner table, something that made her hyper-aware of his presence whenever he was near. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was simply gratitude for his kindness, but she knew in her heart that it was more than that. She was falling in love with Wade Hamilton, with his gentle strength and his generous spirit, and the way he saw her as a person of value rather than a burden to be tolerated. She did not know if he felt the same way. He was always perfectly proper, never overstepping the bounds of employer and employee, but sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression that made her wonder. And there were moments when their hands would brush accidentally, and the contact would linger just a fraction too long, when the air between them would seem to crackle with unspoken possibility. But Clara was terrified to hope, terrified that she was misreading the situation and that any attempt to change the nature of their relationship would result in her losing the home and the security she had found. It was a Saturday in late May, nearly 2 months after Clara had come to the ranch, when everything changed. Wade had gone into El Dorado to conduct some business, and Clara had spent the day doing the weekly cleaning, throwing open all the windows to air out the house and beating the rugs until her arms ached. She had just finished preparing dinner and was setting the table when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the house. Looking out the window, she saw Wade riding up with another man, and even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. She hurried to the door and opened it just as Wade dismounted, and she saw that his face was drawn and pale, his eyes dark with an emotion she could not name. The other man, a stranger to Clara, tipped his hat to her politely, but there was a gravity in his manner that sent a chill down her spine. "Clara, this is Sheriff Martin from El Dorado," Wade said, his voice tight. "He has brought some news that concerns you." Clara's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrible than the last. Had something happened to the few friends she had left in Missouri? Had some crime from her past been discovered, some unknowing transgression that would see her arrested? She clasped her hands together to stop them from shaking and waited for the sheriff to speak. "Miss Kingston, I am sorry to be the bearer of bad news," Sheriff Martin said, his voice kind but firm. "There has been an inquiry made about you by a man named Harold Finch. He claims to be your employer from Missouri, and says that you left his employ without proper notice and owing him money for room and board. He has filed a complaint and is demanding either your return or financial compensation." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, and she reached out blindly for support, her hand finding the doorframe. Harold Finch, the landlord who had suggested she pay her rent in ways that had sent her fleeing in the night. The man who had leered at her and made increasingly bold advances until she had feared for her safety. She had owed him money, that was true, but only because he had raised her rent 3 times in as many months until it consumed almost all of her meager earnings, leaving her unable to afford food and rent both. "That is not true," she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Harold Finch was my landlord, not my employer, and I left because he made it clear that he expected payment of a different kind. I did owe him money, but only because he priced me into a corner deliberately." Sheriff Martin looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Madam, I am not saying I believe his story, but he has filed a legal complaint and I am obligated to investigate. He is demanding $50 in restitution or your return to Missouri to settle the debt through work." $50. Clara's voice rose in disbelief. "My rent was $5 a month, and I was only behind 1 month when I left. How could I possibly owe him $50? He is claiming damages and lost income from having to find a new tenant," the sheriff explained, his expression sympathetic. "Now, I know it sounds excessive, and I suspect a judge would agree, but until we can get this in front of a court, the complaint stands." Wade, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly stepped forward, his face set in hard lines that Clara had never seen before. "How much time does she have before she has to respond to this complaint?" "The hearing is set for 2 weeks from today," Sheriff Martin said. "She will need to appear in El Dorado to present her side of the story. If she fails to appear, a warrant will be issued for her arrest." Clara swayed on her feet, the ground seeming to tilt beneath her. A hearing meant a lawyer, meant expenses she could not possibly afford. It meant facing Harold Finch again, meant having to describe his advances in front of a room full of strangers. It meant the possibility of jail if the judge believed him over her, or worse, being forced to return to Missouri to work off a fraudulent debt. Wade caught her elbow, steadying her, and the warmth of his hand on her arm was the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. "Thank you for letting us know, Sheriff. We will be there for the hearing." After the sheriff left, Wade guided Clara inside and made her sit down at the dining table. He poured her a glass of water and crouched down beside her chair, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Tell me everything," he said softly. "All of it. What did this man do to you?" Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It does not matter. I cannot afford a lawyer and I have no proof of what he did. It will be his word against mine, and everyone knows that a man's word is always believed over a woman's. It matters to me, Wade said fiercely. And you are not going to face this alone. I have money and I have influence in this town, and I will not let some piece of refuse destroy you because he can. Why? Clara asked, the question bursting from her before she could stop it. Why do you care so much? I am just your housekeeper. Wade was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because you are not just my housekeeper, Clara. You have not been for a long time. You are the reason I wake up in the morning with something to look forward to. You are the light that filled this house after years of darkness. You are the person I think about every moment of every day, and the thought of losing you is unbearable. Clara stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Wade, I do not understand. He took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. I am in love with you, Clara Kingston. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you in that dining room, holding your head high despite the cruelty around you. And I have fallen deeper every single day since then. I know I have no right to say this. I know you probably do not feel the same way, but I cannot let you face this threat without knowing how I feel. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She looked at their joined hands, at the way his fingers intertwined with hers, and felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away and protected for so long that she had forgotten it was there. I love you too, she whispered, the words almost catching in her throat. I have been trying to protect myself, but I cannot help it. You are the best man I have ever known, and I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Wade made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then he was pulling her out of the chair and into his arms, holding her so tightly that she could barely breathe. She buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, leather and soap and something uniquely Wade, and felt safe for the first time since her mother had died. They stood there for a long time, just holding each other, and Clara felt the fear that had gripped her since the sheriff's arrival begin to ease. Finally, Wade pulled back just enough to look at her face, his hands coming up to cup her cheeks, his thumbs wiping away the tears that still tracked down her skin. We will fight this together, he said firmly. I will hire the best lawyer in Kansas if I have to. That man will not hurt you again, I promise you that. I do not want your money, Clara protested weakly. You have already given me so much. It is not my money, it is our money, Wade said, and then, before she could process what he meant by that, he continued. Marry me, Clara. Not because of this situation with Finch, not because you need protection or security, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know this is sudden, and you probably need time to think about it, but I cannot imagine my future without you in it. Clara felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. Marriage, to Wade. It was everything she had dreamed of in the secret corners of her heart, but had never dared to hope for. But the timing made her hesitate, made her wonder if he was only asking out of some misguided sense of chivalry. Are you asking because of the hearing? She asked, searching his face for the truth. Because you think being your wife will give me legal protection. I am asking because I want you to be my wife, Wade said firmly, but I will not pretend that it would not help the situation. As my wife, you would have legal standing that you do not have as a single woman. And Finch would have to think twice about pursuing a complaint against the wife of one of the most successful ranchers in the county. But Clara, I would marry you if you had no troubles at all. I would marry you if you were a wealthy heiress with no need of my protection. I am asking because I love you and I want to build a life with you. Clara looked into his eyes and saw only truth there, only love and hope, and a future that stretched out before them bright with possibility. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the heartache and the struggle and the moments when she had thought she could not go on. And she thought about the miracle of Wade Hamilton walking into that boarding house dining room and seeing her, really seeing her, when everyone else had looked through her as though she did not exist. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will marry you." Wade's face lit up with a joy so pure that it took her breath away. And then he was kissing her, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that promised everything and demanded nothing. Clara melted into him, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wade rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "We will get married as soon as possible," he said. "Tomorrow if we can. I want you to have my name and my protection before that hearing." Clara nodded, feeling as though she was caught up in a whirlwind but not wanting it to stop. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, their dinner forgotten on the table as they talked about the future. Wade would ride into town first thing in the morning and arrange for the preacher to perform a simple ceremony. They would need witnesses, and Tom, Jake, and Samuel could serve. It would not be the wedding that Clara might have dreamed of as a girl. No fancy dress or elaborate celebration, but none of that mattered. What mattered was becoming Wade's wife, binding her life to his in a way that nothing could break. That night, Clara lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, too excited to sleep. Tomorrow she would be married. Tomorrow she would become Clara Hamilton, wife to the man she loved, and she would face whatever came next not alone but with Wade by her side. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of rightness, the feeling that everything had been leading to this moment. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Clara dressed with shaking hands in the best of her 3 dresses, the one that was least patched and faded. She pinned up her hair and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. She looked happy, genuinely happy, and the realization brought tears to her eyes. After washing her face, she went downstairs to find that Wade had already left for town. He had left a note saying he would return by noon with the preacher and that she should be ready. Clara spent the morning in a frenzy of activity, cleaning the house until it sparkled and preparing a wedding meal with the best of what she could find in the pantry. She made a roast with vegetables, fresh bread, and even managed to bake a cake, something she had not attempted since before her mother died. The work calmed her nerves and gave her something to focus on besides the enormity of what was about to happen. Wade returned right at noon, just as he had promised, with the preacher in his wagon and the 3 ranch hands riding alongside. The preacher was a kind-faced man named Reverend Thompson, who had married Wade's parents 30 years earlier, and he greeted Clara with warm approval. They gathered in the main room of the house, with Tom, Jake, and Samuel standing as witnesses, and Clara and Wade faced each other in front of the fireplace. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, the words of the marriage service taking on a profound meaning as Clara listened to Wade promise to love, honor, and cherish her for the rest of his life. When it was her turn, her voice shook with emotion as she made the same promises, meaning every word with her entire being. Wade slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, and when Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt something settle deep in her soul, a sense of belonging that she had been searching for her entire life. Wade kissed her softly, reverently, in front of their small audience, and Tom let out a whoop of celebration that made everyone laugh. They had a festive meal, the men praising Clara's cooking and Wade looking at her with such love and pride that she felt her cheeks flush with pleasure. After the meal, Reverend Thompson and the hands departed, leaving Clara and Wade alone in the house that was now truly their home. They stood in the main room, suddenly shy with each other despite the declarations of love and the vows they had just exchanged. Wade reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and Clara felt the cool weight of the wedding ring against her skin. "I know this all happened very fast," Wade said quietly, "and I want you to know that there is no pressure, no expectation. We can take this as slowly as you need." Clara appreciated his consideration, but she was tired of being afraid, tired of holding back. She stepped closer to him, rising up on her toes to press a kiss to his lips. "I am your wife," she said softly, "and I want to be your wife in every way." Wade's eyes darkened with desire, and he swept her up into his arms, carrying her up the stairs to his bedroom, which was now their bedroom. He set her down gently beside the bed and helped her with the buttons of her dress, his fingers sure despite the slight tremble in his hands. Clara helped him with his own clothing, and soon they were skin to skin, exploring each other with gentle touches and whispered words of love. Wade was patient and tender, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Clara felt complete in a way she had never experienced before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, Wade's arms wrapped protectively around her and Clara's head resting on his chest. She could hear the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, and she felt a contentment so deep that it brought tears to her eyes. "Are you all right?" Wade asked, tilting her face up to look at him. "Did I hurt you?" "No," Clara said, smiling through her tears. "I am just happy, happier than I have ever been in my entire life. I keep thinking this is a dream and I am going to wake up back in that cold room above the general store." "This is real," Wade said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You are my wife and I am your husband, and nothing is ever going to change that. Whatever comes, we face it together." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the hearing, and Wade was true to his word about hiring a lawyer. He brought in a man from Topeka, a sharp-minded attorney named Mr. Grayson who listened to Clara's story with careful attention and assured her that Harold Finch's case was full of holes. With Mr. Grayson's help, they gathered evidence, including letters from Clara's former students and their parents testifying to her character, records from the school board showing when her employment had ended, and even a statement from the woman who had rented the room next to Clara's in the boarding house, who had witnessed some of Finch's inappropriate behavior. When the day of the hearing arrived, Clara walked into the courthouse holding Wade's hand, her head held high. She wore a new dress that Wade had insisted on buying for her, a simple but well-made garment in deep blue that made her feel like a different person from the desperate woman who had arrived in El Dorado 2 months earlier. Harold Finch was already there, looking prosperous and confident, but his expression changed when he saw Clara walk in with Wade at her side, her hand adorned with a wedding ring. The hearing itself was brief. Mr. Grayson presented their evidence methodically, building a case that destroyed Finch's claims piece by piece. He showed that Finch had dramatically inflated the debt, that he had engaged in predatory rental practices, and that multiple witnesses could attest to his inappropriate behavior toward his female tenants. Finch blustered and tried to defend himself, but it was clear that the judge, a stern man named Judge Harrison, was not impressed with his arguments. When it was Clara's turn to speak, she told her story clearly and without embellishment, describing the impossible situation Finch had created and the fear that had driven her to leave. She did not cry or plead, but simply presented the facts, and when she finished, Judge Harrison looked at Finch with open contempt. "Mr. Finch, I find your claim to be without merit, and I suspect it is motivated by malice rather than any genuine grievance," Judge Harrison said coldly. "Not only am I dismissing your complaint, but I am ordering you to pay court costs, and I am warning you that if you ever bring another frivolous suit before this court, I will hold you in contempt. Furthermore, I am formally advising Mrs. Hamilton that if you continue to harass her, she should file charges, and I will see that they are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. This case is dismissed." Clara felt Wade's arm tighten around her waist as relief flooded through her. It was over. Finch could not touch her anymore. She was safe, and more than that, she was free. They left the courthouse to find Tom, Jake, and Samuel waiting for them, having ridden in to provide support, and the men congratulated them with genuine warmth. Even Sheriff Martin, who had been present at the hearing, came over to shake Wade's hand and apologize to Clara for any distress the situation had caused. They returned to the ranch that evening as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Clara stood on the porch of the house, Wade's arm around her shoulders, and looked out at the land that stretched as far as the eye could see. This was her home now. This was her life. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about all the pain and struggle, and she realized that she would not change any of it because it had led her to this moment, to this man, to this future that shimmered with promise. As the months passed, Clara settled into her role as Wade's wife with a happiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. She managed the household with efficiency, kept the books for the ranch with meticulous care, and even started a small garden behind the house where she grew vegetables and herbs. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Wade handling the cattle and the land while Clara handled the business side of things, and they made a formidable team. In the evenings, they still sat by the fireplace and talked, but now Wade would pull Clara into his lap and hold her close, and their conversations were punctuated with kisses and laughter. They made plans for the future, talking about expanding the herd, maybe breeding horses, perhaps even starting a family when the time was right. Clara had never dared to dream of having children, had thought that kind of domestic happiness was beyond her reach. But now, she found herself imagining a house filled with the sound of children's laughter, of little ones who would grow up with the love and security that she had never known. That fall, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to be certain before telling Wade, and when she finally did, on a crisp October evening as they sat together watching the sunset, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a shout of joy that probably carried all the way to the bunkhouse. Then he gathered her into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to have a baby," Wade kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "A baby, Clara. Our baby." "Yes," Clara said, her hands resting on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Wade became even more protective after that, constantly worrying that she was working too hard or lifting something too heavy. Clara found his concern endearing even when it became exasperating, and she had to remind him repeatedly that pregnancy was not an illness, and that she was perfectly capable of managing her normal activities. But she also loved the way he would rest his hand on her stomach whenever they sat together, talking to the baby even though it was far too early for it to hear anything, telling their child about the ranch and the life they would have together. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and by the time winter set in, Clara had a noticeable bump that Wade loved to touch and kiss. She continued to manage the household and the accounts, but Wade hired a woman from town to come in twice a week to help with the heavier cleaning, And Tom's wife, a motherly woman named Martha, started coming by regularly to check on Clara and offer advice about childbirth and babies. Spring came early that year, the prairie bursting into bloom with wildflowers, and on a warm April morning in 1879, Clara went into labor. Wade was beside himself with worry, pacing the floor downstairs while Martha and the doctor tended to Clara in the bedroom. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly a full day, but Clara bore it with the same quiet strength she had shown in every challenge she faced. And when she finally heard the piercing cry of her newborn baby, all the pain was forgotten in an instant. "It is a boy," Martha announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a soft blanket. "A healthy baby boy." Wade burst into the room moments later, his face pale and his eyes wild with concern. But when he saw Clara sitting up in bed holding their son, the tension drained from his body, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Clara, and together they looked down at the tiny face of their child. "He is perfect," Wade whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." They named him William, after Wade's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he was loved with a fierceness that surprised them both. Wade was a natural father, patient and gentle with the infant, and he would spend hours just holding his son and staring at him in wonder. Clara, despite her exhaustion from the birth, felt a completeness that she had never known existed. This was her family. These were her people. She was home. William was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Rose, who had Clara's dark hair and Wade's blue-gray eyes, and then 3 years after that by another son they called James. The house that had once seemed so large and empty was now filled with the chaos and joy of children, with toys scattered across the floors and the sound of laughter echoing through the rooms. Wade expanded the ranch, buying additional land and increasing the herd, and under his management and Clara's careful bookkeeping, they became one of the most successful operations in Kansas. Clara sometimes thought about that day in the boarding house dining room, about the woman she had been, desperate and afraid and wearing a tattered dress that had marked her as someone of no consequence. She thought about the laughter and the contempt, and about the cowboy who had looked past all of that and seen her, really seen her, and had decided she was worth taking a chance on. Wade had not just given her a job or a home. He had given her his world, his name, his love, and a future she could never have imagined. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wade surprised her with a new dress, a beautiful green gown with lace at the collar and cuffs, the kind of dress she had once dreamed of owning. She put it on and came downstairs to find him waiting for her in his best suit, and he took her hand and led her out to the porch where the children were playing in the yard under Tom's watchful eye. "You remember the first time I saw you?" Wade asked, pulling her close. "You were sitting in that dining room trying so hard to be invisible, and all I could think was that you were the most courageous person I had ever seen." "I remember being terrified," Clara said with a laugh. "And I remember thinking that you were either the kindest man in the world or completely insane to offer a job to a stranger." "I think maybe I was a little of both," Wade admitted. "But I knew even then that you were special, that you were meant to be part of my life." "You saved me," Clara said softly, reaching up to touch his cheek. "You gave me everything when I had nothing." "No," Wade said, covering her hand with his own. "You saved me. This house, this ranch, it was just a place before you came. You made it a home. You gave me a reason to come in at the end of the day. You gave me a family and a life that is fuller and richer than anything I could have built on my own. We saved each other, Clara." Clara looked out at their children playing in the yard, at the ranch that sprawled around them, at the life they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about every heartache and every triumph, and she knew that Wade was right. They had saved each other, two lonely people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and celebrations. William grew into a strong, responsible young man who loved the ranch and planned to take it over from his father someday. Rose was clever and curious, always reading or asking questions that challenged everyone around her. James was the wild one, constantly getting into mischief, but with a heart so big and generous that it was impossible to stay angry with him for long. Wade and Clara watched their children grow with pride and joy, and they grew older together with grace, their love deepening with each passing year. They added on to the house, creating more space for the growing family and for the grandchildren that would eventually come. The ranch continued to prosper, surviving droughts and hard winters and fluctuating cattle prices because of the strong foundation Wade and Clara had built together. They became pillars of the community, known for their generosity and their fairness, and their home was always open to neighbors in need. On quiet evenings when the children were grown and gone, starting families of their own, Wade and Clara would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, holding hands just as they had done for decades. They would talk about the past and the future, about the grandchildren who visited regularly and filled the house with noise and energy, about the changes they had seen in the world and in themselves. "You ever regret it?" Wade asked one evening when they were both well into their 60s, and the twilight painted everything in soft shades of purple and gold. "Marrying me so quickly, building this life out here in the middle of nowhere." Clara turned to look at him, at the face she loved so deeply, now lined with age but still handsome in her eyes. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You took a woman that everyone else looked through and you saw her. You gave me a home and a family and a life that exceeded every dream I ever had. How could I possibly regret that?" Wade smiled, that same smile that had captivated her from the beginning, and he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Clara Hamilton. I have loved you from the moment I saw you, and I will love you until the moment I die and beyond that if such things are possible." "I love you too," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion, more than words could ever express. They sat together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful and lasting. Clara thought about that tattered dress she had worn so long ago, the dress that had marked her as poor and desperate, and she thought about the woman she had become, strong and confident and loved beyond measure. Wade had seen past the dress to the woman inside, and in doing so, he had given her not just his world but helped her discover her own strength and worth. The ranch would continue after them, passed down to William and his children and their children after that, a legacy built on love and hard work, and the belief that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are rather than judged by circumstances beyond their control. And long after Clara and Wade were gone, their story would be told, the story of a cowboy and a woman in a tattered dress who found each other in a boarding house dining room and built a life that became a testament to the power of love and compassion. Clara lived to see her great-grandchildren, tiny miracles who carried pieces of her and wayed forward into a new century. She held them in her arms and told them stories about the old days, about what Kansas had been like when she first arrived and how much it had changed. She told them about their great-grandfather, about his kindness and his strength, and the way he had changed her life with a simple act of seeing her value when no one else would. Wade passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Clara beside him in the bed they had shared for nearly 5 decades. She held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke with grief, she was grateful that they had been given so many years together, so many memories to carry her through the remaining days. She continued to live in the house for several more years, cared for by her children and grandchildren, who made sure she was never alone. When Clara's own time came, at the age of 82, she died surrounded by family in the bedroom where she had given birth to her children and spent countless nights in Wade's arms. Her last thoughts were of him, of the young cowboy who had walked into her life when she needed him most and had stayed by her side through every joy and every sorrow. She died with a smile on her face, at peace with the life she had lived and ready to be reunited with the man she loved. They buried her next to Wade on a hill overlooking the ranch, where the prairie grass waved in the wind and the sky stretched endlessly overhead. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, and as they stood beside the graves, they told stories about Clara and Wade, about the love that had brought them together and sustained them through decades of life. They spoke of courage and kindness, of second chances and the transformative power of seeing the true value in another person. The ranch continued to thrive, generation after generation carrying on the work that Wade and Clara had started. The house was maintained with love and care, and though it was modernized over the years, the basic structure remained the same, a testament to the foundation that had been laid so long ago. Visitors to the ranch would sometimes see the portrait that hung in the main room, a painting that had been commissioned on Clara and Wade's 25th anniversary, showing them standing together in front of the house, their hands joined, and their faces reflecting the deep love and partnership that had defined their marriage. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as a reminder of what really mattered in life. They learned about the tattered dress and the boarding house dining room, about the laughter of cruel people and the compassion of one good man who refused to judge someone by their circumstances. They learned that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, that kindness was never wasted, and that every person deserved to be seen for who they truly were rather than what they appeared to be. And so the legacy continued, not just in the land and the cattle and the buildings, but in the values that Wade and Clara had embodied and passed down to their children. They had created something that lasted far beyond their own lives, a ripple effect of love and compassion that touched countless people over the decades. The ranch became known not just for its success, but for the fairness with which it was run, for the way the Hamilton family treated their workers with respect and dignity, carrying on the tradition that Wade had established so long ago. On the hill where Clara and Wade were buried, wildflowers bloomed every spring, covering the ground in a carpet of color that could be seen from miles away. Their descendants tended the graves faithfully, making sure they were never forgotten, making sure their story continued to be told. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right and the sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, you could almost feel their presence there. Two spirits joined together for eternity, looking out over the land they had loved and the legacy they had created. The story of Clara and Wade Hamilton became more than just family history. It became a testament to the best parts of human nature, to the capacity for compassion even in hard times, to the courage it takes to see past surface appearances to the true worth of a person. In a world that too often judged people by their clothes or their circumstances or their wealth, their story stood as a reminder that what really mattered was character and heart, and the willingness to take a chance on love. Years later, When historians studied the development of Kansas and the cattle ranches that had shaped the region, the Hamilton Ranch was always mentioned as one of the most successful and enduring. But what set it apart in the historical records was not just its economic success, but the story of its founding. The tale of how a desperate woman and a compassionate cowboy had come together to build something that lasted. Their story was taught in schools and written about in books, and it inspired countless people who heard it to look beyond the surface and to offer kindness to those who needed it most. The town of El Dorado grew and changed over the decades, transforming from a rough cattle town into a proper city with all the modern amenities. But the older residents never forgot the Hamilton family and the contributions they had made to the community. There was a scholarship established in Clara's name for young women seeking education, and a youth ranch program established in Wade's name that taught horsemanship and responsibility to children from all backgrounds. These programs continued for generations, helping hundreds of young people and spreading the values that Clara and Wade had held dear. The boarding house where they had first met was eventually torn down to make way for a bank, but a historical marker was placed on the site telling the story of what had happened there one spring evening in 1878. Tourists would stop to read it and take photographs, and many of them would be moved by the simple tale of kindness and love that had unfolded in such an ordinary place. Some would drive out to the ranch to see where Clara and Wade had lived, and the Hamilton family always welcomed them graciously, understanding that their ancestors' story belonged not just to them, but to everyone who believed in the power of compassion and second chances. The tattered dress that Clara had worn that fateful evening was preserved by her children, carefully stored away as a precious relic of where they had come from. It was displayed occasionally at historical exhibitions, and people would stand before it with tears in their eyes, thinking about the frightened young woman who had worn it and the cowboy who had seen past it to the person underneath. The dress became a symbol, a reminder that material wealth meant nothing compared to character, and that every person deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their circumstances. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Hamilton Ranch continued to operate, now run by the fifth and sixth generations of Clara and Wade's descendants. They faced challenges that their ancestors could never have imagined, from changes in agricultural practices to environmental concerns to shifts in the economy. But they faced them with the same determination and integrity that had been passed down through the generations. They never forgot where they came from, never forgot the story of the woman in the tattered dress and the cowboy who had given her his world. And so the love story of Clara Kingston and Wade Hamilton lived on, not just in history books and family stories, but in the very fabric of the community they had helped to build. It lived on in every act of kindness shown to a stranger, in every person who looked past appearances to see the true worth of another human being, in every second chance given, and every life transformed by compassion. Their story proved that one moment of kindness could change everything, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that two people who chose to see the best in each other could create something beautiful that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. The ranch house still stood on its hill overlooking the prairie, weathered but strong, a testament to the enduring nature of what Clara and Wade had built together. Inside, the rooms echoed with the memories of all the laughter and tears, all the meals shared and children raised, all the quiet moments and grand celebrations that had filled their years together. The fireplace, where they had sat so many evenings, still crackled with warmth on cold winter nights, and the dining table where they had shared their first meal as employer and employee still hosted family gatherings where stories were told and traditions were honored. The land itself seemed to remember them, the prairie grass waving in patterns that looked almost like a dance, the creek running clear and cool just as it had when Wade had first shown it to Clara. The cattle that grazed on the hills were descendants of the herds that Wade had built, and the horses in the corrals carried the bloodlines of the animals he had trained with such patience and skill. Everything about the place spoke of continuity and legacy, of a love that had taken root in Kansas soil and grown into something magnificent. On summer evenings, when the family gathered for reunions and celebrations, they would often end the night standing on that hill where Clara and Wade were buried, looking out at the ranch spread below them and the stars spread above them. They would tell the story again, making sure the youngest generation knew where they came from and what values they were expected to uphold. They would talk about courage and kindness, about seeing the worth in every person, and about building something that would last beyond their own brief time on Earth. And in those moments, standing together under the vast Kansas sky, they could feel the presence of their ancestors, could sense the love that had started it all still flowing through them like a river connecting past to present to future. Clara and Wade's love story had not ended with their deaths. It continued in every heartbeat of every descendant, in every act of compassion, in every moment when someone chose to see beyond surface appearances to the true value of another person. Their love had created a legacy that would endure as long as there were people who believed in the power of kindness and the possibility of second chances, as long as there were those who understood that true wealth had nothing to do with material possessions and everything to do with the connections we forge and the lives we touch. The woman in the tattered dress and the cowboy who saw her worth had proved that love could indeed change everything, and their story would continue to inspire and guide those who came after them for generations yet to come.